All right. Hi, everyone. This is Mr. P. I'm going to redo the Harlem Renaissance video because I added new content for the virtual class that I didn't put in the previous video. So I'm going to go through some of the stuff I did go through in the previous video fairly quickly. Check out that video for more detail because I want to get to the new content. So just a reminder, the Harlem Renaissance is, in terms of its underlying causes, made possible in some ways by the Great Migration, the mass migration of Black folks from the South to the North, in many ways fleeing violence and terror. And so Harlem in New York becomes the site of this renaissance of Black art. It's also in many ways it's a response to two things. One, the racist caricature of the Jim Crow era, depicting Black folks in very contradictory ways as both desexualized and hypersexualized, as overly aggressive, as extremely subservient, depending on whatever need the kind of white racist imaginary needed. And it's also a response to the assimilationist trends within Black art movements, such as what we saw with the Du Bois photography exhibit in 1900 in Paris. And so there's many Harlem Renaissance artists who want to resist the assimilationist patterns. Check out the songs, dances, and poetry here at the playlist link that I put together there from some archival videos. In terms of the origins of the Harlem Renaissance, there's two figures I wanted to highlight. Victoria Earle Matthews, a Black woman in 1895 who wrote a piece called The Value of Race Literature, demonstrating that Black art forms were undervalued, and she wanted to value Black art forms such as the spiritual and bring those to the forefront. And this serves as a forerunner of later, 30 years from that point, people like Elaine Locke over here and others who want to do the same thing. And so it's important, I think, to recognize the role that Victoria Matthews played, kind of bringing attention to that in the 1890s. Du Bois captures it really well when he talks about the Black theater here. He talks about the importance of having a Black theater that is about Black life, by Black artists and authors, for Black audiences, and in Black neighborhoods. And so this kind of, I think, in many ways captures the thrust of the Harlem Renaissance. There's contradictory aspects to it, of course, but in many ways it's about creating a space for Black artists to thrive, creating art for Black communities. Harlem, at the beginning of the Great Migration, and I know some of you kind of in our class renamed that as the Great Escape or the Flee from Terror. So that mass migratory pattern, Harlem was primarily white, and by the end of the first stage of that, 1930, is a majority Black. And so Harlem becomes the site where many of these artists live. It's not the only site, but it is the namesake. We talked in class about how it was political during the Harlem Renaissance. So I have a few pieces here. I have pieces that depict striving for freedom. Aaron Douglas's piece down here in the lower left-hand corner, you can see that the chains are breaking, Black figures fighting in wars, whether it's scholars or preachers with books, striving for freedom. And so you see that in a lot of Aaron Douglas's pieces. You see it in Horace Pippin's piece, kind of toward the tail end, right after the Renaissance period, with this double victory piece where, depicting victory at home and victory abroad, which we'll talk about in this during as a forerunner of the civil rights movement. But the attention to freedom, themes of freedom, and political, social, economic freedom is present in the Harlem Renaissance. You have August Savage's sculpting here, famous sculptor. Here she depicts kind of Negro spiritual singers, and trying to honor that artwork, that art form, that Black art form. And Richmond Barth, a gay Black sculptor, during and after the Renaissance period, depicts a lot of Black male form. And this is political too, right? Because being out and about queer desire, gay desires, is something that it was often criminalized during that period. And so, to have a Black sculptor as part of the Renaissance depicting those themes is really important. Connected to that is to this role that art is political is the importance of jazz and blues. And in many ways, jazz and blues was rejected by some of the more elite assimilationist artists of the Harlem Renaissance, because jazz and blues is something that came from the streets of New Orleans, the streets of Louisiana, Mississippi, and in so many ways is depicting Black life not in its assimilationist space, but Black life uh, in poverty, Black life on the streets of these southern states, Black life that rejected assimilation. And so this, in many ways, is kind of, I think, one of the most important aspects of the Harlem Renaissance. Langston Hughes, I think, says it really well when he talks about jazz to him as one of the inherent expressions of Negro life in America. And some of the main figures here, and I encourage you to check out this video and go to the playlist to listen to some of these artists. Gertrude Ma Rainey, who was a queer Black jazz artist, blues artist, and Bessie Smith, Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington. These are some of the kind of more famous jazz and blues artists. I'll talk about Ma Rainey in the next in a little bit. There's another aspect to the Harlem Renaissance that's crucial to our understanding, and this is part of the new content here, is the subset of Black artists at the time who rejected assimilation. And Wallace Thurman and Zora Neale Hurston are two of those figures who rejected assimilation, and they named themselves a name that combined the N-word with the term literati. And that was intentional. So the term literati, and you can see this term up here, the term literati, right, refers to people who are considered well-educated, really into literature. And so they carved their space out within the Harlem Renaissance. And Dr. Kendi refers to this group of artists, Ma Rainey, Wallace Thurman, Zora Neale Hurston, Langston Hughes, as possibly the first known fully anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-homophobic, intellectual and artist group in American history. And Langston Hughes puts it well here when he says, the urge within the race towards whiteness and to be as little Negro and as much American as possible was the mountain standing in the way of any true Negro art. The only duty Hughes dropped onto the younger Negro artist was to change the force of his art, the old whispering, I want to be white, hidden in the aspirations of his people, to why should I want to be white? I am a Negro and beautiful and ugly too. And for Langston Hughes, in writing this sort of kind of manifesto of this particular movement within the Harlem Renaissance, it was about rejecting assimilationism, rejecting the striving towards whiteness to be accepted in American society. If you listen to my piece on Du Bois's double consciousness theory, you'll know that's something that Black communities have been striving for or wrestling with for quite some time and still do. And this group said, why try to be this white version of American? Why not fully embrace Blackness? So you have pieces like Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God, her novel depicting Black Southern life in Florida. Wallace Thurman, The Blacker the Berry, centering a dark-skinned Black woman as the main character and the struggles she faces and the need to affirm dark-skinned Black folks and the beauty and fullness of that. And so, you might be familiar with song lyrics that reference this novel, actually. So this is a really important, I think, aspect to the Harlem Renaissance. I'm not going to kind of do an analysis of all of these poems I have here. This is where in class we paused. We did a breakout room session. So I encourage you to pause, go through some of these poems I have here and do some reading and analysis. Think about the message of the poem, the historical context. I'll try and fill you in with the historical context here and leave you to pause and analyze some of this poetry. You might choose one of these pieces for your Harlem Renaissance creative response, maybe do a painting or something in response to the poem, or write a poem in response to the poem as well, which some of you have been doing. Gertrude Rainey is one of my favorite figures of the Harlem Renaissance, a forerunner to jazz, a blues artist. One of my favorite pieces of her is called "Prove It On Me Blues," where she talks very explicitly about her, attraction towards women. She talks about, how, if you look at here, they say I do it. Ain't nobody caught me. Sure got to prove it on me. Went out last night with a crowd of friends. They must have been women because I don't like no men. It's true I wear a collar and a tie. So she goes on. It's very much about breaking those gender expectations and norms, and she's really open with her sexuality, which got her in trouble sometimes with the police. She was arrested when she held parties for a lot of women and lesbian women, things like that. Queer communities were highly criminalized in the early to mid 1900s. The other thing I wanted to mention was that there was a group of women in DC who met at, I believe it was Gwendolyn Bennett's nail salon in, I want to say it was on C Street in DC, where Angelina Grimke, Georgia Douglas Johnson, a lot of other women of the Harlem Renaissance met there, many of whom were bi or gay or queer, and they shared their poetry, and it was a queer affirming space within the Renaissance and within the art movement. You might want to spend some time with Langston Hughes. This is one of his first poems, where it really embraces African identity. Parts of the Harlem Renaissance were about reaching back, wrestling with identity and reaching into, if America doesn't embrace us, what is the source of Black identity? And many artists turn to Africa. Some with an exotification of Africa, some, I think in this piece here, right, kind of recognizing the deep ways in which Africa still runs through Black life in America. And connects that, right? Connects the Mississippi to the Nile, to the Congo. So check that poem out. Georgia Douglas Johnson is one of the lesser recognized women of the movement. Is able to publish her poetry. Not many women were able to publish full books of poetry at the time. So you can check out her piece here, The Heart of a Woman. Langston Hughes' Minstrel Man is a kind of really bitter and intense piece, kind of critiquing minstrelsy. So you might want to check that piece out. Claude McKay responds to the 1919 Red Summer, the mass lynchings in many northern and southern cities, with a piece here called If We Must Die. You can connect this. Think about the efforts for armed self-defense, for fighting back at the time, right? Not just accepting the mass lynchings, but actually, taking up arms and fighting back. And Claude McKay captures that really well here. One of the last pieces I want to talk about is the audiences for some of the dancing and music. And there's two big sites here, the Cotton Club and the Savoy. The Cotton Club was white-owned for white clientele and in many ways tried to recreate a plantation environment. This was a space that depicts a whole range of racist ideas and policies. Black women had to be of a particularly light skin tone to perform here. They called Duke Ellington's band, the shows that he performed here, Jungle Nights, which depicts a really exotification of Blackness. And so you see a lot of ways in which the Cotton Club, which was for a white audience, is kind of recreating racist policies in the midst of the Renaissance. And so the Savoy is the space that is the heartbeat of Harlem, according to Langston Hughes. It's the Black managed ballroom that was primarily Black audiences. It was integrated, so there were white folks who went here. And this was a space that fully affirmed, I think, Black art, Black dance, and Black people. And Frankie Manning's was one of the more famous dancers who performed there and in other places. He kind of made very popular and the Lindy Hop forerunner of swing dancing. So you can check out some of those videos there. And check out my overview of the creative response assignment so you can kind of engage and create your own work in response to a Harlem Renaissance artist of your choice. I have 33 artists listed on the classroom assignment post. So that's the Harlem Renaissance, and I was excited to kind of add some new material, so I hope you enjoyed it.